Andy Dufresne, a banker, is convicted of murdering his wife and her lover, a golf pro, in 1947. He receives 2 consecutive life sentences and is sent to the notoriously harsh Shawshank prison. Andy maintains his innocence, but his cold and calculating demeanor leads everyone to believe he did it. Meanwhile, Ellis Boyd Redding, also known as Red, is being interviewed for parole after serving a 20-year sentence at Shawshank. Red's parole is denied despite his best efforts and behavior, which doesn't bother him all that much. Red is then introduced as the local smuggler who can get prisoners anything they want as long as it is reasonable. An alarm sounds to notify all prisoners of new arrivals. Red and his friends bet on which new fish will have a nervous breakdown on his first night in jail. Red places a large bet on Andy. During the first night, an overweight newly arrived inmate, nicknamed Fat Ass, crumbles and sobs, allowing Haywood to win the bet. The celebration, however, is cut short when the chief guard, Byron Hadley, savagely beats up the fat man for not keeping quiet when asked to. Meanwhile, Andy maintains his calmness. The inmates learn the next morning that Fat Ass died in the infirmary because the prison doctor had gone out for the night. Andy asks Haywood for the man's name, but he declines. Andy approaches Red about a month later, having heard of his talent for finding things. He requests that Red get him a rock hammer, which he claims is required for his hobby of rock collecting and sculpting. Andy laughs as Red asks him a few questions about his intentions. Red agrees to place the order but warns Andy about the Sisters, a group of prisoners who sexually assault other prisoners, most importantly their leader, Boggs, Mark Ralston, who has a crush on Andy. Though the other prisoners see Andy as a really cold fish, Red sees something in him and likes him right away. Red believes Andy wants to use the hammer to engineer an escape in the future, but when he finally sees the tool's genuine size, he understands why Andy laughed and laughs with him, dismissing the idea that Andy could ever use it to dig his way out of prison. Andy spends the first 2 years of his prison time working in the prison laundry or fighting Boggs and the Sisters. Andy is beaten and raped on a regular basis despite his persistent resistance and fight, but he remains silent about it. When a work detail for tarring the roof of one of the prison's buildings is announced, Red uses his connections to get Andy and a few of their mutual friends assigned to the job, giving everyone a break from the routine. Andy overhears Hadley complaining about having to pay taxes on an upcoming inheritance while on the job. Andy, using his experience as a banker, explains to Hadley how he can avoid paying taxes by converting his money into a one-time gift for his wife. He then offers to help Hadley with the paperwork in exchange for some cold beers for his fellow inmates while tarring. Hadley threatens Andy with throwing him off the roof at first, but eventually agrees to provide the working inmates with cold beers before the job is completed. Andy may have engineered the privilege to gain favor with the prison guards as well as his fellow inmates, but Red believes Andy did it simply to feel normal again. While watching a movie, Andy approaches Red with another unexpected request, Rita Hayworth. The demand surprises Red, but he agrees to place the order. Andy gets into the Sisters again as he exits the theater. Despite his ability to talk his way out of being raped, he is brutally beaten within an inch of his life, landing him in the hospital for a month. Boggs is sentenced to a week in solitary for the beating. When he arrives, Hadley and his men are waiting for him in his cell. They severely beaten him, leaving him unable to walk or eat solid food for the rest of his life, and he is transferred to a prison hospital upstate. The Sisters leave Andy alone and never bother him again. When Andy arrives from the infirmary, he finds a collection of rocks for him to sculpt and a huge poster of Rita Hayworth in his cell, all these gifts from Red and his friends. Warden Samuel Norton comes to know about Andy's assistance to Hadley and conducts a surprise cell inspection to assess Andy. While the guards are turning the cell upside down looking for illegal possessions, he finds Andy reading his copy of the Holy Bible and they discuss their favorite verses. The warden leaves, satisfied with their encounter, almost forgetting to return Andy's Bible. He then encourages Andy to keep reading the Bible, saying that salvation lays within. Andy is later informed that he will be working in the prison library alongside overaged inmate Brooks Hatlin. When a prison guard arrives and asks Andy for financial advice, the reason for his transfer becomes clear. Andy sets up a makeshift desk and begins working, advising most prison guards on financial matters and assisting them with their income tax returns. Andy sees an opportunity to expand the prison library and begins by requesting funds from the Maine State Senate. Every week, he writes letters. His financial support profession is so well liked that guards from other prisons seek Andy's financial advice when they visit for inter-prison baseball games. Andy is even preparing his tax returns for the warden. Soon after, Brooks snaps and threatens to murder Haywood in order to avoid parole. Andy has the skill to calm him down. When his friends discuss Brooks' behavior, Red feels sympathy for Brooks, who has clearly become institutionalized after spending 50 years at Shawshank. He has essentially been conditioned to be a prisoner for the rest of his life and is unable to adapt to life outside the prison walls. Remarks in Red, "These walls are funny. You hate them at first, then you get used to them. After a while, you become reliant on them." Brooks is granted parole and is placed in a halfway house. He is also assigned to work at a supermarket, which he dislikes. He eventually commits suicide after finding it impossible to adjust to life outside the prison, leaving the message, "Brooks was here," carved on a wooden beam. Andy receives $200 from the state for the library after 6 years of writing letters, along with a collection of old books and phonograph records. Despite the fact that the state senate believes this will be enough to put an end to Andy's letter-writing campaign, he remains undeterred and redoubles his efforts. Andy discovers a copy of Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro among the donations of old books and records that arrive at the warden's office. He locks the warden's office guard in the bathroom and plays the record over the prison's PA system. The music quickly captivates the entire prison. Red observes that the voices of these women gave everyone a brief sense of freedom. Outside the office, Norton is enraged by Andy's defiance and orders him to turn off the record player. Andy responds by increasing the volume. Andy is immediately sent to solitary confinement for 2 weeks after the warden orders Hadley to break into the office. When he gets out, he tells his friends that the stretch was the easiest time he's ever had in the hole because he spent it listening to Mozart's Figaro for comfort. When the other prisoners tell him that's unlikely, he talks about the power of hope in prison and how it can sustain them. Red strongly disagrees with Andy, claiming that hope is a dangerous thing to have in a place like Shawshank, and advises Andy to get used to living without it. Andy implies that this is exactly what Brooks did, and Red storms out of the room. Red has a new parole hearing not long after and realizes he's been in prison for 30 years. He says the same words he said 10 years ago, but with no enthusiasm. His parole is denied once more. Andy presents him with a harmonica to commemorate his 30th year, to which Red responds by presenting Andy with a giant poster of Marilyn Monroe to commemorate his 10th year. For years after the Mozart incident, the state senate finally decides that they cannot get rid of Andy with just another check. So they give him a $500 budget per year to build his library. Andy makes wise use of it, striking deals with book clubs and charities to build the best prison library in the state, which he names after Brooks. Andy begins mentoring inmates who want to get their high school diplomas so they can get a good job when they get out, owing to the expanded library and more materials. Meanwhile, Warden Norton takes advantage of Andy's knowledge and devises a scheme in which he employs prisoners to work on public projects that he wins by outbidding other contractors. He occasionally allows other contractors to score projects if the bribe is sufficient. Andy launders the money by opening several accounts in various banks and making several investments under the guise of Randall Stevens, a man who only exists on paper, which Andy created himself using his knowledge of the system and mail-ordered. Randall Stevens has a birth certificate, a social security number, and a driver's license. If anyone ever looks into the scheme, they will pursue a man who only exists on paper. Andy tells Red about it, noting that he had to go to prison to learn how to be a crook. Tommy, a young prisoner, arrives at Shawshank to serve time for breaking and entering in 1965. Tommy is friendly with both Andy and Red and is easygoing, charismatic, and popular among the other inmates. When Tommy explains that he's been in and out of prison since he was 13 years old, Andy suggests that Tommy consider a career other than theft because he doesn't seem to be very good at it. Tommy is moved by Andy's suggestion and asks him to assist him in obtaining his high school equivalency diploma. Tommy is a good student, but he is frustrated when he takes the exam and crumples it up and throws it away. Andy finds it and sends it in any case. Tommy inquires about Andy's case, to which Red responds. Tommy appears to be upset after hearing the story. He then tells Andy and Red about a former cellmate from another prison who boasted about murdering a pro golfer at the country club where he worked, along with his lover. The woman's husband, a banker, was imprisoned for the murders. With this new information, Andy meets with the warden, expecting Norton to assist him in obtaining a new trial with Tommy as a witness. Norton's reaction is totally opposite to Andy's expectations. When Andy states emphatically that he will never reveal the money laundering schemes he has set up for Norton over the years, the warden becomes enraged and sentences him to solitary confinement for a month. The inmates debate the sentence, noting that it is the longest period of solitary confinement they have ever heard of. They also realize Andy may be innocent after all, having spent nearly 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. Tommy receives notification from the Board of Education that he passed the exam and now has a high school diploma. Andy smiles as a guard passes the news to him in his solitary cell. Tommy is later escorted outside at night for a private meeting with the warden. Warden Norton questions him about the story he told Andy and whether he would be willing to testify on Andy's behalf. Tommy enthusiastically agrees. The warden gives him a smile before nodding to Hadley to shoot him. When the warden visits Andy in solitary, he informs him that Tommy attempted to flee and that Hadley was forced to shoot him. Andy does not believe Norton's story and informs him that everything has come to an end and that he will no longer work for him. The warden threatens to close the library, burn all the books, and move Andy to a much different cell in a much different part of the prison with the most hardened criminals. He then leaves and orders Andy to spend another month in solitary confinement to think things through. When Andy is finally released from solitary confinement, he and Red have a conversation in which Andy talks about his wife and how much he loved her, and how he feels responsible for her death despite the fact that he did not pull the trigger. He then discusses his future plans if he ever gets out of prison. He talks about Zihuatanejo, a beach town on Mexico's Pacific coast where he wants to live for the rest of his life and manage a hotel. He then asks Red if he wants to join him, to which Red says no and that he, like Brooks, believes he is too far gone. He then criticizes Andy for allowing Hope to play such chaos with his mind, claiming that it will only destroy him. Andy agrees and prepares to leave when he asks Red if he is familiar with the Buxton, Maine area. He then tells Red about a particular hay field with a large oak tree at the end of a stone wall. He then asks Red to promise him that if he is ever released, he will go back to that oak tree and retrieve something hidden among the stones, but he refuses to say what it is. Red makes a promise but is concerned about his friend's mental state. His concerns are heightened when he learns Andy has requested a 6-foot rope from Haywood. Andy, Red believes, has reached his breaking point and is about to commit suicide. Meanwhile, Norton requests that Andy shine his shoes and dry clean his suit before retiring for the night. When Andy returns to his cell, the guards turn off the lights for the night. It was the longest night of Red's life, he says. Andy has not answered the morning call and is not standing in front of his cell as he usually does. The guard yells at Andy for being late and walks to his cell, expecting to find a severely ill or dead Andy. At the same time, Norton becomes concerned when he discovers Andy's shoes in his shoe box rather than his own. The alarm then sounds, alerting the inmate that he is missing. Norton rushes to Andy's empty cell and demands an explanation. Hadley summons Red, who insists he is unaware of Andy's plans. Norton, who is becoming increasingly hostile and paranoid, begins throwing Andy's sculpted rocks around the cell. When he throws one at Andy's Raquel Welch poster, the rock punches through and into the wall. Norton rips the poster from the wall, revealing a narrow tunnel large enough for a man to crawl into. In a series of flashback sequences narrated by Red, it is revealed that many years ago, shortly after receiving his rock hammer, Andy innocently attempted to carve his name on his cell wall when a chunk of it came off. Andy, who was interested in geology, realized that the material used to construct the wall could allow him to dig a hole if he ever needed to escape. Andy first ordered a huge Rita Hayworth poster to cover up the hole. He then spent years digging with his rock hammer at night and stuffing dirt from his job into his pockets, which he would then empty in the courtyard during his morning walks. Andy decided to leave after Tommy was killed. Andy wore Norton's clothes underneath his own to his cell during the previous night's thunderstorm, catching a lucky break when no one noticed Norton's shiny black shoes on his feet, including Red. He escaped through his hole after packing many of his belongings, some papers, and Norton's clothes into a plastic bag that he tied to himself with the rope he'd requested. The tunnel he'd dug led him to a space between two prison walls, where he discovered a sewer main line. He used a rock to hit the sewer line in time with the lightning strike several times, eventually breaking it open. Andy emerged in a brook outside the walls after crawling through 500 yards of raw sewage contained in the pipe. His prison clothes, a bar of soap, and a very worn-out rock hammer were later discovered by a search team. Andy walks into the Maine National Bank in Portland, where he had put Norton's money, while the warden and Red are investigating Andy's brilliant escape. He closes the account and walks out with a cashier's check, using his assumed identity as Randall Stevens and all the necessary documentation. Before he departs, he requests that a package be mailed. He continues his visits to nearly a dozen other local banks, eventually collecting $370,000. Warden Norton's accounting books are included in the package, which is delivered directly to the Portland Daily Bugle newspaper, along with Andy's written confessions and testimony. Soon after, Maine State Police and several reporters stormed Shawshank Prison to cover the developing story. Hadley is arrested for Tommy's murder and taken away by state police. According to Red, he heard unfounded rumors that Hadley began crying like a little girl in the back seat of the police squad car as he was being taken away. Warden witnessed Hadley being taken away in a police squad car and the local district attorney entering the prison with several police officers holding a warrant for Norton's arrest. Norton finally opens his safe in his office, which he hadn't touched since Andy escaped, and instead of his books, he finds the Bible he had given Andy with a note to the warden saying that he was right, salvation did lay within. Norton then opens it to Exodus and discovers that all of the pages have been cut out in the shape of Andy's rock hammer. As the cops pound on his door, Norton returns to his desk, pulls out a small revolver, and shoots himself in the head. Red wonders if the warden considered how Andy could ever have gotten the best of him before pulling the trigger. Red soon receives a postcard from Fort Hancock, Texas, with no writing on it. Red interprets it as a sign that Andy has made it to freedom in Mexico. Red and his friends pass the time by talking about Andy's exploits, with a few embellishments, but Red suffers from depression as a result of missing his friend. In 1967, at Red's next parole hearing, he tells the parole board that rehabilitated is a made-up word invented to justify their job. He then expresses how much he regrets his previous actions, not because he is in prison, but because he realizes how wrong they were. He then concludes by saying that he will have to live with that for the rest of his life and requests that the board stop wasting his time and leave him alone. His parole has been granted. He goes to the same places Brooks did to live and work, even seeing Brooks' message carved into a wooden beam. He frequently passes by a pawn shop with several guns displayed in the window. At times, he considers returning to prison because he feels he has no life outside of the prison where he has spent the majority of his adult life, but he remembers the promise he made to Andy. He then reveals that he was looking at the compasses behind the guns rather than the guns themselves, and he bought one. Red takes Andy's advice, hitchhiking to Buxton and discovering the stone wall Andy described. There is, as Andy mentioned, a large black stone. Underneath is a small box containing a large sum of money and instructions to come find him in Zihuatanejo, though he does not name the city in case it is misplaced. He also claims to be looking for someone who can get things for a project of his. Red suddenly realizes the power of hope and is ecstatic about the feelings he is experiencing. Red violates parole and leaves the halfway house, unconcerned because no one is likely to conduct an extensive manhunt for an old crook like him. Red takes the bus to Fort Hancock, where he enters Mexico. The two friends are finally reunited on a Pacific Coast beach, just as Andy had hoped.